Hello and welcome to Mostly Climate. I'm Doug McNeall. As part of our series investigating the future of snow and ice, in this episode we hear how climate change is affecting archaeology, and in particular, glacial archaeology. To learn what glacial archaeology is and how climate change impacts this unique field of study, I spoke to archaeologist Lars Pilø of the Cultural Heritage Department at Innlandet County Council, Norway.
Glacial archaeology is a new and developing field in archaeology brought on by climate change. The glacial ice in the higher mountains is retreating due to the warming, and this has turned out to be a boon for archaeology, rather surprisingly, because it turns out that there are a lot of artifacts and other interesting stuff preserved inside the ice. So that was a huge surprise when this started happening. And it's been developing for the last 25 years.
So many of our listeners might remember Ötzi, the Iceman. Was that one of the first objects that was found, one of the first sort of major finds of glacial archaeology, or does the field date back prior to that?
Well, he is obviously the most spectacular find in glacial archaeology ever. He would be hard to top, but he's not the earliest finds. There are finds going back to 1914 here in Norway, and into 1925 in Northern America. But the field really only started to open up in 1997, when there was a huge melt in the mountains of Yukon in Canada, and lots of stuff started melting out. And then after that, there were further melts in Alaska, in other provinces in Canada, in the US, in the Alps, and then in Norway from 2006 onwards. There was a huge heat wave here in the late autumn in 2006, and we had suddenly hundreds of finds melting out.
It's clearly been a really sort of recent development as climate change has started impacting on the high mountains in the Northern Hemisphere in particular. Just to give our listeners an idea, what kind of objects do you find and how old are these objects?
Well, to get to the age first, the earliest objects we have now here in Norway, they are 6,000 years old. We still expect them to become older as the ice melts back, but there's a sort of a back limit to how old they can get, because we had the Holocene thermal optimum 8,000 years ago here, and at that time there was probably very little ice in the high mountains of mainland Norway. So that's sort of the back door, but they're 6,000 years old now. Basically, there are two kinds of sites connected to glacial ice. And one kind of sites, which are the most common ones up here, are hunting sites. So the reindeer on hot days in July and August, they get bothered by pestering insects, especially insects that would like to lay their eggs, like their botflies that would like to lay their eggs in the throat or in the skin of the reindeer. And the reindeer don't like that. So they go up on the ice and snow because the botflies won't fly over snow. So they know they're safe there during the day. The botflies are only active when it's really warm. Once it gets to the evening and it cools down, the reindeer can go down and start foraging again. But obviously the old hunters knew this, right? So they knew that they could hunt them on their way to the ice patch, or they could hunt them when they were on the ice patch. So that's one kind of site. And on sites like that, you will find artifacts that are connected to hunting, obviously. Arrows, we have over 200 arrows melting out of the ice. And you can find a bow if you're really lucky, or other kinds of hunting implements. And then you have the transport sites. There was a lot of traffic through the high mountains in the old times, much more than we thought before the ice started melting. Some of this terrain is quite difficult to pass. But if you use the ice, there's a firm snow there. You can use it sort of as a highway. It's very easy to walk across. But obviously, if you do that a lot of times, you will drop stuff. And on sites such as that, you can find basically anything, because there's a much broader sort of part of the material culture that gets left behind there. So we found remains of sleds, dead pack horses. We even found a 16th century dog, complete skeleton of one. You can find clothing items. We have a Viking Age mitten or 1700-year-old tunic, and all kinds of stuff. So that's the two main types of sites.
And are some of these objects better preserved than others? Do you find those because they last longer, or do you find them because, they were more often dropped? And what are the processes in the high mountains and on the ice which preserve these objects?
Well, to take the second question first, it's really important if you want the objects to preserve that they should not be on what we call a regular glacier, one of these large moving glaciers that sort of dig their way through the terrain. If artifacts get lost there, which obviously they will be crushed by the moving ice and dumped at the mouth of the glacier. So there won't be much to find. What you need are non-moving accumulations of ice, what we call ice patches. So if you have that, that's a much larger chance for the objects to survive. It doesn't mean that the ice patches don't move. They actually do move, but they just move much more slowly than regular glaciers. So that's one part. But the second part is that most of the objects, they go a bit in and out of the ice. They're lost up on the snow. And then because ice patches react much quicker to changes in weather and climate than glaciers do, they sort of expand and contract all the time. The objects that are lost on the ice there, they often melt out. And once they get out on the surface of the ice, they get washed downhill by meltwater or moved by wind or whatever, and end up in front of the ice. And then the ice expands over it again and retreats and expands. So many of the artifacts are going in and out of the ice. And that means that some parts of the artifacts will deteriorate or get lost, like the fletchings for arrows, or the sinew, which has been used for securing the fletching or the arrowhead, while the arrowhead itself and the wooden shaft may still be preserved. So when we are lucky and we are at the site, when the stuff comes out of the ice for the first time, they look like they were lost yesterday. And this can be quite confusing to an archaeologist, because normally when you find stuff, it looks old. You can see that it's old. But the stuff that comes out sometimes, it looks brand new. So the ice, it's a cliche, but it works like a time machine sometimes.
You've got some wonderful pictures on your Twitter feed, which is how I found your work, with these incredible objects looking as if they're freshly made and really well preserved. How does it feel to find one of these objects, knowing that you're the first person that's seen it since it was lost maybe 1,000 years ago?
Yeah, it's an awesome feeling. It's really hard to compare to anything. I mean, I remember back 10 years ago when we discovered the Lendbrain mountain pass. We found an arrow inside it, but it was a really small arrow. It was only 26 centimeters long, and it was blunt at one end. And we realized quite quickly that it had to be a toy arrow, because there's not enough impact energy for that to kill anything. So it was a practice for a child. Just think about this kid who lost its arrow up there and was probably sad because it gone missing in the snow and thought it was lost forever. And then 1400 years later, it comes out of the ice. It's just incredible.
That's fantastic. I guess these objects were quite valuable at the time to these people. They may have been relying on them, or in that case, it sounds like a kid may have been learning their way of life.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, learning to hunt with bow and arrow was really important at the time. And this arrow, which was from about 600 AD, I mean, this is in the chunk in the middle of the late Antique Little Ice Age, where we can see from our finds that there's actually increased hunting activities taking place at the ice patches, probably because the conditions for agriculture were poor during the time, and they had to rely more on hunting and gathering.
So you can see, can you, as you're looking at the objects through time, you can see how maybe the climate was affecting people's lives as they were traveling through time?
Yeah, we can see that the number of finds will vary over time. The late Antique Little Ice Age example of increasing finds, that's the clearest one we have. And of course, the further you go back, you get what we call a taphonomic overprint. And that means that for some periods, finds will be maybe missing because the ice may have been smaller and stuff may have melted out and been lost over time. So it's quite complicated. It used to be thought that when the ice expanded, there would be more finds because they would preserve more. And then when it contracted, there would be fewer. as ice would be lost. But the reality is that we have now a lot of radiocarbon dates, and we have the glacier curves for our area, and it's not so easy. And also some of these artifacts, like things which are wooden or in bone, or they can preserve for quite a long time outside the ice. We found a piece of an Iron Age arrow 100 meters away from the ice edge, from one of our ice patches. So of course they don't look fresh out of the ice, but it's still preserved. So it's not like they melt out one day and they're gone the next. We thought that in the beginning and we were quite stressed, but now we understand that we have a little better time to collect the stuff.
And is that because of the conditions, the meteorological conditions around them? Does that help preserve them?
Yeah, there are two things. I think one of the meteorological conditions, as you say, it's cold and dry. So even though it melts out, it doesn't melt out into a humid 25 degrees Celsius environment. It's maybe between 0 and 5 degrees in the summer when it's out, and it's normally quite dry. We can also see that sometimes there's a local microenvironment. If there's a huge boulder there which provides shade and maybe catches snow better during winter, stuff behind that on the northern side of that will also preserve better. So there's both the larger and the micro environmental conditions that play a role.
You're working at really high altitudes a lot of the time here, and you maybe work a really long way, a resupply. What are the real challenges of glacial archaeology? What does a field trip look like?
Yeah, well, it's very different from lowland archaeology. I can tell you that. Basically, we do three different kinds of field work. So we do what we call exploratory surveys, where we don't know if there are finds, or maybe we have a report from a mountain hiker that he thinks he or she has seen something, and we go out to check it. So that's normally a 1 day hike. Well, we travel light with very little equipment just to check out the site, see if there are finds. If there are finds, how many are there? And if it's a really huge site, we need to look for a campsite and access and water, stuff like that. But then if we find a site and it's large, we need to come back with a systematic survey. And this is a very different business. We use pack horses to get up to the sites. We have a base camp. We stay for a week or 10 days. The actual field work along the ice is quite different. Normally, we don't really have to excavate the objects because Mother Nature does the excavation by herself by melting the ice. So we normally just survey along the edge of the ice, and then we mark objects, and we have a finds team which will follow along and collect the objects. So that's normally quite easily done. But sometimes the objects are still stuck in the ice, and we can't wait. And that happened in 2021 when we found a ski up at the Diegergarten mountain. And the funny thing about that story is that we found a ski there in 2014. And this ski was later dated to 700 AD, so it's pre-Viking, and it's incredibly well preserved with the binding still there. And we could make copies and ski down the slopes and see how it worked. So that was great. But there was only one ski, and these skis they normally can appear in pairs. So maybe the other ski is also there. But there was no ice retreat, and we followed the ice patch on satellite imagery. And then in 2021, we could see that the ice patch had retreated, and we sent up an archaeologist to check for the ski, and he found it. And it was also even better preserved with the binding and everything. So we sometimes we excavate, but normally we don't. We just collect the stuff.
You've mentioned maybe some of this already about how climate change is affecting your work. So it sounds like you're going back to a site regularly because the climate is changing fast enough that it's worth going back as the ice retreats. Is that sort of an ongoing retreat, or do you see the ice return and then go back again, like waves coming in? Or is it that the ice goes back year on year?
There are two parts to answering that. And one thing is that the ice doesn't go back in sort of in a linear fashion. It's more like the Arctic sea ice, that it goes up and down, but the trend is down. And with the current prognosis is that with the locked-in warming we have already, our climatologists here in Norway tell us that 90% of the Norwegian high mountain ice will melt away in this century. So the ice is going. But the second thing is that the ice patches are a funny lot because they don't act like glaciers or other ice accumulations. They mainly feed off wind-drifted snow. So they're normally situated, not exclusively, but normally situated on the northern parts, the slopes of mountaintops. Often there may be a small depression there as well. And if the ice patch melts back, they have a greater chance of catching snow in the winter. So they are sort of self-sustaining. And we can see that, for instance, there's one site, it's not in our county, but just north of it, but they have shown that by radiocarbon dating the ice, that there are 2,000 years of ice missing in the stratigraphy there from the first and the second millennium before Christ. Those 2,000 years are missing. And this is also a period where many of our finds are not so well preserved. So probably the ice retreated. It was warmer and the ice retreated. But the older ice still survived. So we don't know how it's going to play out. We know the ice patches are going to melt away. But we're not sure whether it's going to happen really fast, so that it will be in the next couple of decades, or whether they will be able to keep going until the end of the century.
Part of that uncertainty sounds like it's to do with the processes in the ice itself, but a part of that uncertainty sounds like it might be due to the sort of extent of climate change and how serious climate change becomes over the next century. So would you say that the impact on glacial archaeology might be different depending on people's actions and the way that climate change actually pans out?
Yeah, I mean, the warmer it gets and the higher the temperature rises, the more ice melt we will experience, at least in our area, which is very much temperature dependent. So that's definitely going to happen.
You mentioned before the possibility that maybe 90% of these ice patches or 90% of the ice in Norway in the high mountains would melt. Would you say then there's almost a possible race against time to make these discoveries? There's a kind of natural time limit on glacial archaeology as it is at the moment, which would mean that you would need to discover as much as possible as quickly as possible.
It's sort of strange. I just wrote a small paper about this to the Journal of Glacial Archaeology, where I try to see the future of glacial archaeology, because now we're sort of in the middle of a boom. And it's not, I mean, it's certainly not only Norway, the Alps, there's a lot happening. There's new stuff happening in Mongolia, in Canada, in the wider Yellowstone area in the US. So there's a lot of melting going on. But at some point, the ice will be gone. And the field phase, the fieldwork phase of glacial archaeology will be over. What we'll have left is the stuff that we were able to collect and document while the melting happened. So we're sort of in a time limited phase. It's a very different field from other archaeology.
I was going to say, as somebody who's been at the forefront of this field for a while, how does that make you feel?
It's difficult to describe, but it's exciting and sad at the same time. I sometimes get into discussions with people on social media with this, because we have people cheering on global warming on our Facebook page, saying, "Oh, it's great, more melting, and there will be more finds." And I say, well, Lars, this is this is a two-sided story, and I mean, we enjoy the finds. But we have gotten to the point now where we also get criticized by people when we enjoy our finds, because people say, "Oh, but there's a dark background to the finds. You forgot that, did you?" I said, "No, we didn't. We're in the field for maybe 4 weeks to 6 weeks a year. That's sort of between the snow has melted from the previous year and the new winter snow comes. And we worry about climate for the rest of the year. But when we're in the field, we are allowed to enjoy the finds."
It's absolutely understandable, the joy of discovery and pushing back knowledge. I read on some of your social media that sometimes you get people who are skeptical of climate change commenting on your work. What would you say to them about what you see and what you do? What would you like people who are skeptical of climate change to understand?
Well, I think there are two different types of what I normally call climate science deniers. And I always try to have a friendly conversation with them. The strange thing with, as an aside here, that these people don't really deny climate science. They only deny the part of climate science that they don't like. right? So they deny only the modern part, right?
Cherry picking, yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because you've mentioned several times the fact that ice has retreated in the past, and that clearly climate has changed in the past, but we know from physics that it's different this time, right? So I can see that your some of your evidence that you're discovering might bolster this kind of skeptical view that climate has changed in the past.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens is that they say, yeah, but the stuff here is found on the ground. So that means that there was no ice here when it was lost. And that means that climate has changed in the past. How could that happen? I mean, the Vikings didn't have cars. How could that happen? So, I mean, as you know, there's a couple of things that are inherently wrong in this approach. The first thing is that obviously climate has changed in the past. Everybody who has read up on climate science knows that. And glaciers have expanded and retreated over time. As you said, the difference now is that humans influence the climate. And as I try to explain, just because climate change happened for natural reasons in the past, that doesn't mean that humans cannot have an influence on it now.
There was one thing I wanted to pick up on, actually. You mentioned earlier the process by which reindeer, I think you said, went to the high meadows, maybe, or went up to the high mountains because they were avoiding the flies or the insects or the biting insects. And it got me thinking, there are clearly sort of ecological processes which our ancestors in the past have exploited and interacted with. Do you notice climate change impacting the ecology around you? Maybe when you're on these field trips, can you see what's it doing to the local wildlife and ecology?
I think for our mountains, it's still a bit early, but obviously when the ice melts, there will be major consequences of that. And one of the reasons will be that there will be no ice for the reindeer to go up to, and there will be no water for irrigation. That will be gone, and it's also used for hydroelectric plants, and that will also be gone. So that will be one thing. And obviously, what we can see is that the tree limit, or forest limit, is going up. So it's the landscape is changing definitely. But once you're up at the high mountains, up at the ice, the landscape still looks, I think, more or less like it did in the Stone Age. So that's sometimes it's very nice. You stand there, you can see the reindeer, and you think there was a hunter. I mean, sometimes you can see the hunting blinds, which are stone built. They are still preserved in the terrain there, and you can sit in one of those and look at the reindeer and think somebody was here 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and saw the exact same thing.
Lars Pilø of the Cultural Heritage Department at Innlandet County Council, Norway. My thanks to Lars for that fascinating insight into glacial archaeology. And if you'd like to see some of the incredible artifacts that his team have discovered in recent times, head over to Lars's Twitter channel, Secrets of the Ice, or visit the website secretsoftheice.com. For now, though, I'm Doug McNeall, our editor was Adrian Holloway, and producer Claire Nazir. This has been Mostly Climate. Thanks for listening.
Mostly Climate is a podcast by the UK Met Office. For the latest weather conditions where you are, download the Met Office weather app.